in a quiet, faraway part of the world. There was a small town surrounded by forests and rivers, a place where life moved slowly and people lived in close-knit communities. For generations, the villagers had depended on their traditions, their beliefs, and each other to navigate the challenges of life. They trusted the wisdom of their elders, they celebrated festivals together, and they shared the joys and struggles of daily living. Life was simple, but it was predictable, and the people found comfort in that predictability. Then, one day, a stranger arrived. The stranger's name was Arik. He was not like anyone the villagers had ever seen before. He had a presence that drew people in, a voice that was calm yet commanding, and a look in his eyes that seemed to promise knowledge beyond ordinary understanding. Arik did not arrive with fanfare or announcement. He came quietly, walking into the village like he had always been part of it. At first, the villagers were cautious. Outsiders were not always welcome, especially those who seemed different. But there was something about Arik that made them curious rather than suspicious. He spoke of things they had only heard in stories of a greater power, of unseen forces that could guide and protect them, of a world beyond the one they could touch or see. Soon, Arik began gathering small groups of villagers around him. He told them that he had been chosen to lead, that he had been given a special connection with the divine. At first, people laughed. They were simple folk, used to hard work and daily routines, and the idea that someone could be a god seemed impossible. But Arik was patient. He did not demand belief. He invited it. He told stories of miraculous events, of people healed by his touch, of rains that came when he prayed. Slowly, his tales began to take hold. People began to whisper about his powers, about the strange things they had witnessed. Crops that had been failing grew overnight. Illnesses seemed to improve under his guidance, and even the animals in the village acted differently around him. Arik's rise was quiet, almost unnoticed at first, but as more villagers came to see him, the sense of awe grew. He spoke with authority, but he also listened. He asked people about their lives, about their fears, about their dreams. He seemed genuinely interested in helping them. And in a world where life was often harsh and unforgiving, this was a rare gift. People felt seen, felt valued, and in return they began to trust him. What began as curiosity soon became devotion. Families brought their children to him for blessings, elders sought his advice, and those struggling with sickness or misfortune came hoping for relief. Arik did not claim to be perfect. He admitted to mistakes, spoke of learning and growth, and yet he always hinted at something greater within him, something extraordinary. He told his followers that the world was not as it seemed, that ordinary people were capable of extraordinary things if they could see beyond the surface of reality. This idea was intoxicating. People who had felt powerless suddenly believed they were part of something larger. They felt special, chosen, as if they were being prepared for a future that was far brighter than anything they had ever imagined. It was not long before Arik began forming a structured community. He asked his followers to live together, to dedicate their time to learning his teachings, to helping each other, and to trusting him completely. The community was isolated, set apart from the rest of the town and the nearby villages. Outsiders were welcome only if they came with good intentions and respect for the rules of the group. Within this circle, Arik established himself as the central figure, the one whose word was law, whose guidance was unquestionable, and whose presence inspired reverence. People began to look up to him, not just as a teacher, but as something greater, someone divine. Stories of Arik's supposed miracles spread beyond the village. Travelers came to see for themselves the man who could heal the sick, control nature, and seemingly bend reality. Some were skeptics, but many were convinced by what they witnessed. His followers, already loyal, testified to his power with passion and conviction. Their stories reinforced each other, creating a powerful image of a man who was no ordinary human. The lines between faith and reality began to blur. Villagers who had been skeptical before found themselves drawn in by the mounting evidence, or at least by the compelling stories of those who had been close to him. The more people believed in Arik's divinity, the more his influence grew. He began to teach that he was not just a guide for individual lives, but a leader for humanity, a bridge between mortals and the divine. He spoke of a world where suffering could be diminished, where people could transcend their ordinary limitations, where life itself could be more than just a series of struggles. This message resonated deeply, especially in a time and place where life was unpredictable and often cruel. People wanted hope, they wanted meaning, and Arik offered it to them in abundance. But what made Arik's rise truly fascinating was how he managed to weave ordinary human emotions into the divine narrative. He did not simply demand obedience. He created bonds. He showed kindness, empathy, and generosity. But he always reminded people that these virtues were part of something greater, part of the path he had revealed. He celebrated achievements, comforted in times of loss, and praised loyalty. People began to see him as the embodiment of their aspirations, their fears, and their dreams. In his presence, they felt understood in ways no one else had ever understood them. Despite all this, Arik's life was not without mystery. He rarely spoke of his past, and when he did, it was always vague, almost mythical. He told stories of distant lands, secret knowledge, and encounters with forces beyond human understanding. These stories were both mesmerizing and disorienting. Followers were drawn in by the sense of wonder, by the feeling that they were witnessing something larger than life. In a world where they felt small and insignificant, Arik gave them a place of importance, a sense that they were chosen to be part of something extraordinary. The community flourished under Arik's leadership, at least on the surface. People worked together, shared resources, and supported each other in daily life. But beyond the harmony, there was an undercurrent of tension. Questions arose quietly among some followers, questions about the true nature of Arik's powers, about the extraordinary claims, and about the secrecy that surrounded certain aspects of his life. For the most part, these doubts were suppressed, either by fear of being ostracized or by the powerful emotional pull of the community. Nevertheless, Arik's influence was undeniable. He had created a world where people felt valued, inspired, and connected to something larger than themselves. He had crafted an image of godlike authority, reinforced by both real and imagined miracles, personal attention, and the collective energy of devoted followers. People believed, and in believing, they made Arik powerful not because he truly possessed divine abilities, but because he had learned to harness the most human and universal of desires, the desire to hope, to belong, and to find meaning in a complicated and often harsh world. The stage was now set for a story that would captivate not just a small village, but the world. Arik's power, built on faith, devotion, and the careful construction of his image, seemed unshakable. Outsiders marveled, followers adored, and even those who were skeptical could not deny the magnetic pull he had over people. What began as curiosity and cautious interest had transformed into a phenomenon that blurred the lines between reality and belief, between human and divine. It was a delicate balance, one that promised both wonder and danger in equal measure, a balance that would soon be tested in ways that no one could have anticipated by the end of this period. Arik was no longer just a stranger who had wandered into a village. He had become a symbol, a figure larger than life, and a force that would shape the lives of those who followed him and challenged the world that watched from outside. In a community that had once been quiet and ordinary, a new era had begun, one filled with devotion, awe, and the tantalizing suggestion that humans could touch the divine. The seeds of belief had been planted, and the roots were deep, setting the stage for events that would change everything. Life in the village had changed in ways that nobody could have imagined before Arik arrived. What had started as curiosity and awe now began to take on a more serious and intense dimension. The villagers, who once led quiet, predictable lives, were now living inside a world shaped entirely by Arik's influence. Every day seemed guided by his presence. Every decision seemed to reflect his teachings. And slowly, people's devotion shifted from simple admiration to unquestioning obedience. At first, this transformation seemed harmless, even inspiring. People felt part of something extraordinary, something larger than themselves. But as the days turned into months, the challenges of living under a self-proclaimed god became apparent, and the cracks in the picture-perfect world began to show. Arik's demands on his followers began subtly. He asked for small sacrifices at first, a few hours of labor in the fields, some extra food to support the community, a willingness to share personal experiences during the gatherings. The villagers, filled with admiration and trust, complied without hesitation. They saw these requests as steps on the path to spiritual growth, as lessons from a divine teacher. Yet these small sacrifices gradually evolved into larger, more demanding expectations. People were expected to dedicate more of their time, energy, and resources to the community, sometimes at the cost of their own families and personal well-being. Alongside these increasing demands, Arik's teachings grew stricter. What was once an open discussion about life and spirituality became a rigid set of rules that dictated behavior, thought, and even emotion. Followers were told exactly how to live, what to say, and what to believe. Questioning Arik's authority was discouraged. Curiosity outside the prescribed teachings was labeled as dangerous or even sinful. Many villagers obeyed out of devotion, believing that their leader's guidance was the path to salvation. Others obeyed out of fear of rejection, fear of punishment, or fear that straying from the path would bring misfortune. The combination of devotion and fear created a powerful grip, one that made it increasingly difficult for people to think independently. Despite the growing tension, Arik's charisma and the appearance of miracles kept his followers loyal. He continued to perform acts that seemed extraordinary, healing the sick, predicting events, and providing solutions to problems that seemed impossible. Whether these acts were real miracles or clever tricks, the villagers believed in their authenticity. Stories of these events spread quickly, attracting attention from outside the village. Travelers, journalists, and curious outsiders began to visit, eager to witness the supposed divine power firsthand. This outside attention brought both admiration and scrutiny, and it marked the beginning of a challenge that would test the very foundation of Arik's influence. Some villagers, however, began to notice inconsistencies. They observed that not every sickness was cured, not every problem resolved, and that some of Arik's miracles could be explained by natural events or coincidence. Despite these doubts, fear and social pressure often silenced questioning voices. Many people convinced themselves that miracles were real, even when evidence suggested otherwise, because admitting doubt felt like betraying their faith or their community. These internal struggles created an invisible tension. Loyalty clashed with skepticism, hope clashed with reason, and admiration clashed with fear. As Arik's authority solidified, he began to extend his influence beyond personal guidance into matters of wealth and labor. Followers were asked to give more than they could comfortably spare. Money, valuables, and time were collected to support the community in what Arik described as divine projects. Families gave up savings, lands, and possessions, believing that these offerings were investments in their spiritual future. The act of giving was framed as a sacred duty. To refuse was seen as a moral failure or even an affront to the divine. People who might have questioned these demands often swallowed their doubts, afraid of losing status or acceptance within the community. Meanwhile, the inner dynamics of the community began to show signs of strain. Some followers grew exhausted from the workload, others felt anxious about the constant expectations, and a few began secretly documenting events that seemed troubling or contradictory. One member, in particular, began keeping a private journal, recording everything from instances of unfulfilled promises to subtle forms of manipulation. This person's observations marked the beginning of a hidden resistance, acquired awareness that not everything in Arik's world was as perfect or divine as it appeared. The outside world also began to take notice. Journalists wrote about the growing community, reporting on both the devotion of the followers and the strange rumors of abuse, coercion, and secrecy. Some reports praised Arik for the unity he had created. Others hinted at darker realities, noting that the community operated with little transparency and that followers were subjected to strict control. These early investigations were met with resistance from Arik and his inner circle. Outsiders were often dismissed as skeptics or enemies who could not understand the truth. Yet, the seeds of doubt planted by these early reports were beginning to grow, even if only quietly, in the minds of some villagers. As the challenges mounted, Arik's control tactics became more sophisticated. He began using fear as a tool to maintain obedience. Followers were warned about external threats, about the dangers of outsiders who might try to steal their faith or disrupt the community. He framed challenges and hardships as tests of loyalty, suggesting that suffering could be a form of divine approval if endured correctly. This created an environment where questioning authority felt dangerous, where fear and devotion reinforced each other, and where skepticism could be seen as moral weakness. The tension reached a new level when a few brave villagers started to push back, albeit quietly. They asked questions during gatherings, hesitated to offer resources, and began to voice concerns about the growing demands placed upon them. Arik, skilled in manipulation and persuasion, responded with a mix of charm and subtle threats. He would remind them of their past devotion, point to the miracles they had witnessed, and warn them about the consequences of doubt. These confrontations were small, but they marked the beginning of a subtle but growing resistance, an indication that not all the villagers were willing to give up their autonomy without question. At the same time, the community faced internal challenges unrelated to Arik's leadership. Conflicts arose over resource distribution, personal relationships, and the pressures of daily life under strict control. These issues were often exacerbated by Arik's insistence that loyalty and obedience were paramount, leaving little room for ordinary human negotiation or compromise. In this environment, even minor disagreements could feel amplified, and the pressure on individuals intensified. Some followers began to experience stress, anxiety, and doubt, but the cultural norm of obedience made it difficult to express these feelings openly. Despite these rising challenges, Arik remained remarkably skilled at maintaining the loyalty of the majority. He continued to inspire AEW to perform miracles, and to present himself as the embodiment of divine wisdom. He praised followers for their devotion, comforted them during crises, and framed all difficulties as opportunities for growth. The combination of fear, admiration, and hope created a powerful psychological bond that kept most followers aligned with his vision. Even as questions and doubts simmered beneath the surface, the community remained largely cohesive, bound together by shared belief and shared experience. By the time the outside world's scrutiny began to intensify, Arik's control over the village was well established. The stage was set for conflict, not a sudden explosion, but a slow escalating struggle between faith and reason, between loyalty and doubt, between the appearance of power and the reality behind it. Some villagers began to quietly prepare themselves for a confrontation with truth, documenting inconsistencies and sharing concerns in hushed conversations. Others remained devoted, convinced that Arik's guidance was the only path to spiritual fulfillment. The community had become a microcosm of a larger struggle, a place where human hope, fear, and faith would collide in ways that were both inspiring and dangerous. As the rising challenge intensified, it became clear that Arik's power was not absolute. It depended entirely on belief, on devotion, and on the willingness of people to trust him. And yet, because so many had already committed their lives, resources, and energy to him, the risk of questioning him felt enormous. This tension between dependence on the leader and the emerging doubts would define the next stage of the story. It was a delicate balance, one that could tip in either direction. And it was during this time that the first seeds of confrontation began to take root, slowly and quietly, in the hearts and minds of those who had once seen Arik as a god. The rising challenge, then, was not just about external scrutiny or the occasional whisper of doubt. It was about the internal struggle within each follower, the tension between what they had been taught to believe and what their eyes, minds, and hearts were beginning to tell them. It was about fear, devotion, and the human instinct to survive and protect one's family. It was about the realization that blind faith could be dangerous, and yet the comfort of belief was hard to relinquish. Arik's world, once a haven of awe and wonder, was starting to feel like a complex web of control, expectation, and subtle manipulation, a world where every decision, every thought, and every act of devotion was carefully observed and often exploited. In this environment, the story of faith, power, and human struggle was reaching a critical point. The villagers, torn between love and fear, devotion and doubt, were beginning to experience the rising challenge that would eventually define their lives. It was a challenge that would test not only their loyalty to Arik, but also their courage, their judgment, and their ability to recognize the difference between illusion and reality. The small village, once a place of quiet simplicity, had transformed into a world dominated by Arik and his supposed divine power. For years, his followers had obeyed without question, offering their loyalty, their labor, and their resources, believing in his extraordinary abilities. But the delicate balance between faith and doubt that Arik had maintained was beginning to crumble. Subtle signs of tension were now turning into overt challenges, and the cracks in his godlike facade were starting to appear in ways that could no longer be ignored. The escalation was underway, and it would soon reach a critical point that would test everyone involved. It began quietly, as all serious disruptions often do. Some of the villagers, particularly those who had been silently observing inconsistencies for months, began to voice their concerns. At first, these were small remarks during private conversations, questions about why certain miracles didn't work for everyone, why some problems persisted despite Arik's intervention, or why he seemed to favor certain followers over others. These murmurs spread slowly through the community, creating pockets of skepticism. But in a society built on absolute loyalty, even minor doubt was dangerous. Those who questioned too openly risked ostracization, punishment, or public humiliation. Arik, keenly aware of these undercurrents, responded in his own way. He intensified his displays of power, performing miracles in more public settings and creating spectacles to reaffirm his authority. There were dramatic healings, predictions of local events, and carefully orchestrated signs meant to awe the crowd. His charisma, always a potent tool, was now being used deliberately to suppress doubts and to reinforce his image as a divine figure. Yet, while these performances convinced many, they could not silence all questions. Some followers saw through the theatrics, noticing inconsistencies in timing, preparation, or outcomes. Others began documenting these incidents, keeping records of events that contradicted Arik's claims. At the same time, the pressures on the community grew. Arik demanded more from his followers than ever before: longer work hours, larger financial contributions, and total devotion to the group's activities. Families were separated for extended periods, children were subjected to strict routines, and personal freedoms were curtailed under the guise of spiritual discipline. The psychological weight of obedience was immense. Many followers became exhausted, anxious, or resentful, yet the fear of reprisal kept them in line. Some internal conflicts began to surface: arguments over work distribution, disagreements about the fairness of Arik's decisions, and disputes about who received special attention or favors. These tensions were amplified by the underlying realization that the power they had once revered might not be as divine as they had believed. The outside world began to take a more active interest as well. Journalists, humanitarians, and former villagers who had left the community started raising alarms about potential abuses. Reports circulated of forced labor, coerced donations, and strict control over personal lives. Some outsiders tried to visit the village to investigate, only to be met with hostility or strict restrictions. Arik framed these interventions as threats to the community, portraying outsiders as enemies trying to undermine the divine mission. This narrative worked on some followers, reinforcing loyalty through fear, but for others, it was the beginning of doubt, turning into action, a realization that the so-called divine authority might be exploitative rather than sacred. Tensions reached a turning point when a whistleblower from within the inner circle decided to speak up. This person had been close to Arik for years, had witnessed the behind-the-scenes manipulations, and had collected undeniable evidence of deceit and coercion. The whistleblower began secretly sharing information with select villagers and trusted outsiders, documenting instances where Arik's teachings conflicted with his actions. This was dangerous work. Discovery could mean severe punishment or worse. Yet, the whistleblower's courage sparked a quiet but growing resistance. Those who had once feared speaking out began to consider that it was possible to confront the deception without immediate retribution, especially if they acted collectively. The critical moment arrived when a humanitarian organization gained access to the village. They arrived cautiously, aware that the community was tightly controlled and wary of outsiders. What they found confirmed many suspicions. Children were malnourished, individuals who resisted certain rules were isolated, and labor was distributed unevenly, often placing the most physically or emotionally vulnerable at the greatest disadvantage. The evidence of coercion and abuse was undeniable. The organization immediately contacted local authorities and began planning interventions to protect the most vulnerable members of the community. This external pressure created a perfect storm: internal doubt, growing resistance, and undeniable outside scrutiny converging at the same time. Arak's response was dramatic. He publicly condemned the outside interference, portraying it as a threat to divine order and a test of loyalty for his followers. He organized large gatherings where he demanded absolute devotion, warning that betrayal would result in misfortune, spiritual failure, or social exile. He performed more spectacular miracles, aiming to awe the community into continued obedience. Yet these measures were increasingly ineffective. Many followers, now aware of the truth, were no longer swayed by displays of power. Fear could only hold them so long. Reason, evidence, and the innate desire for freedom began to outweigh loyalty to a fabricated god. The tension reached a climax when a group of followers organized a mass exodus. It began with small acts of defiance, individuals refusing to participate in tasks, quietly packing belongings, or seeking permission from outsiders to leave. As their courage grew, more people joined, culminating in a coordinated effort to escape the village and break free from Arak's control. The departure was risky. Those attempting to leave faced threats, public shaming, and the potential for physical harm. Yet the desire for freedom outweighed the fear. Families fled together, children in tow, determined to reclaim autonomy and safety. The world outside watched as the seemingly invincible Arak faced the ultimate challenge. His followers, once devoted to him as a god, were leaving, shattering the illusion of power he had so carefully constructed. During this critical moment, the psychological impact on the remaining followers was profound. Some wavered between loyalty and the growing realization of deceit. Others became angry, feeling betrayed by those who had left. Arak, despite his charisma and previous displays of power, was unable to restore full control. His image as a divine figure was cracked, and cracks in faith spread quickly. The once unquestioned authority he had wielded so effectively now faced challenges on multiple fronts: internal resistance, external scrutiny, and the undeniable reality that miracles alone could not sustain obedience indefinitely. As the exodus unfolded, the truth of Arak's influence became undeniable. The very qualities that had inspired his charisma, his control over rituals, and his supposed miracles were revealed to be human, carefully constructed, and manipulable. The realization spread that the community's devotion had not been proof of divinity, but proof of psychological influence. Followers came to understand that their sacrifices, labor, and obedience had fueled a system designed to benefit a single individual rather than serve a divine purpose. The illusion of power, built over years, was collapsing under the weight of evidence, courage, and collective action. The critical moment was not only a confrontation between the followers and Arak, it was also a confrontation within each individual. Many had to reconcile the years of faith, devotion, and sacrifice with the stark reality that they had been manipulated. Emotional turmoil was inevitable. Feelings of anger, betrayal, sadness, and even relief mingled as people navigated this painful yet liberating realization. This inner struggle, experienced by so many simultaneously, intensified the crisis, making the collapse of Arak's authority as much psychological as social. The escalation had transformed the community. The village, once a place of wonder, had become a stage for conflict, truth, and courage. Arak's godlike image was fractured, and his ability to manipulate his followers was severely diminished. The critical moment had revealed the limits of charisma, the dangers of blind devotion, and the power of collective action and reason. The followers who left carried with them not only their freedom but also the lessons of what had transpired, lessons about trust, faith, and the human capacity to reclaim autonomy in the face of manipulation. This stage of the story demonstrated that power built on illusion, fear, and unquestioning loyalty is inherently fragile. No matter how convincing the display, no matter how deeply people are drawn in by charisma and hope, truth and courage have a way of breaking through. The critical moment was both an ending and a beginning, the end of Arak's control over the community, and the beginning of a journey for the followers to rebuild their lives, recover their independence, and reconcile with the reality they had once denied. In the aftermath of this crisis, the foundation was laid for resolution. The community, though shaken, had demonstrated that humanity through courage, evidence, and solidarity could confront even those who claim godlike power. The events of this period were intense, emotionally charged, and transformative. They marked a turning point not only in the story of Arak and his followers but in the larger narrative about the limits of authority, the strength of human resilience, and the power of critical thought when combined with courage. After the dramatic exodus of followers and the exposure of Arak's deceptions, the village and the surrounding region were left in a state of tension and uncertainty. The once seemingly invincible figure who had claimed divinity was now vulnerable, and his carefully constructed world was collapsing. The resolution of this story did not happen instantly, nor was it a simple matter of Arik being removed from power. It was a complex process involving law enforcement, humanitarians, former followers, and the broader community. What followed was a series of events that would finally dismantle the illusion of power, restore a sense of justice, and allow those who had suffered under Arik's rule to begin the slow process of rebuilding their lives. Authorities were initially cautious in their approach. They knew that entering a community so tightly controlled, where followers had been conditioned to obey without question, could create danger. A misstep could provoke violence or further manipulation. Therefore, officials coordinated with humanitarian organizations and local leaders to assess the situation carefully. Evidence collected by whistleblowers, journalists, and concerned former followers played a crucial role. It documented patterns of abuse, coercion, and deception. This documentation allowed the authorities to approach the situation methodically, ensuring that legal measures could be taken while minimizing risk to those still within the community. When intervention finally began, it was deliberate and well-planned. Authorities entered the village with a clear goal: to protect vulnerable members, investigate Arik and his inner circle for criminal activity, and create conditions for the safe reintegration of followers who had been controlled, isolated, or exploited. The arrival of law enforcement and humanitarian workers was both intimidating and liberating for the residents. For those who had secretly doubted Arik, it was confirmation that their fears were justified. For others who had maintained belief until the end, it was a shocking disruption to the only world they had known. Nevertheless, this intervention was a critical step toward resolving the crisis and ensuring that the illusion of divine power could no longer dominate the community. Response to this intervention was predictable yet revealing. He attempted to maintain control by asserting moral and spiritual authority, declaring that outsiders were enemies who sought to destroy the community. He delivered public addresses, urging followers to remain loyal and promising divine protection for those who obeyed. Yet, the impact of these messages was greatly diminished. Many followers had already left or were in the process of leaving. Others were disillusioned, having witnessed firsthand that the miracles, guidance, and power Arik claimed to possess were nothing more than human manipulation. The authority that had once seemed unshakable was crumbling in the face of evidence, courage, and the coordinated efforts of outsiders. Legal proceedings became a central part of the resolution. Arik and his inner circle faced charges ranging from fraud and coercion to abuse and exploitation. These cases were complicated, as the authorities had to navigate not only criminal law but also questions about the psychological manipulation of devoted followers. Witnesses included former members of the community who had fled, whistleblowers from within the inner circle, and journalists who had documented suspicious activities. Testimonies were powerful and emotional, painting a picture of a leader who had exploited faith and devotion for personal gain. For the survivors, participating in these proceedings was both empowering and painful. It required recounting experiences that were often traumatic, but it also provided an opportunity for justice and validation. The process of dismantling Arik's infrastructure went beyond legal action. The community itself needed rebuilding. Structures that had been used to maintain control, meeting halls, surveillance systems, and restrictive living arrangements were repurposed or removed entirely. Resources were redistributed to ensure that no individual could exploit others in the same way again. Humanitarian workers provided support to help former followers regain basic necessities, medical care, and education for children who had been neglected or kept isolated. Psychological counseling became a crucial part of this process, as individuals worked through trauma, fear, and confusion, learning to rebuild a sense of self and autonomy after years of manipulation. One of the most important aspects of resolution was the restoration of trust within the community. Followers had been encouraged to distrust outsiders, question their own judgment, and rely solely on Arik for guidance. Breaking this cycle required time, patience, and consistent support from trained professionals. Group therapy, educational programs, and mentorship initiatives helped survivors reconnect with one another and with the broader world. They learned that questioning authority was not a betrayal of faith or morality, but a necessary step toward independence and self. This rebuilding of trust was not immediate, but it laid the foundation for a healthier, more resilient community. As the legal and social processes unfolded, former followers began sharing their stories publicly. Memoirs, interviews, and articles provided insight into the inner workings of Arik's community, documenting both the wonder and the horror of life under his influence. These narratives served multiple purposes. They allowed survivors to process and validate their experiences, educated the public about the dangers of blind devotion to charismatic figures, and contributed to broader societal awareness about psychological manipulation and coercive control. Many former followers took on advocacy roles, helping prevent similar situations elsewhere by offering guidance, warning signs, and support for those at risk. The dismantling of Arik's influence also involved addressing the lingering cultural and emotional impact. Faith, hope, and a desire for meaning are deeply human needs, and the followers had been drawn to Arik because he promised fulfillment of these needs. Post-intervention programs sought to replace destructive devotion with healthier outlets for spiritual and personal growth. Communities were encouraged to engage in collaborative projects, celebrate cultural traditions, and find purpose in service, creativity, and education rather than in obedience to a single authoritarian figure. This reorientation was essential to prevent survivors from seeking similar forms of guidance elsewhere, helping them to reclaim agency over their beliefs and decisions. While Arik's legal consequences and the structural dismantling of his influence were essential, the emotional and psychological resolution was equally significant. Survivors had to confront feelings of guilt, shame, and betrayal. Many wrestled with the realization that they had trusted someone who had exploited their faith and devotion. Support networks, counseling, and community solidarity helped people navigate these emotions, transforming pain into understanding and resilience. Over time, survivors began to recognize their own strength, courage, and capacity to make independent decisions, qualities that had been suppressed during years of manipulation. By the end of this period, the resolution was clear. Arik was no longer a godlike figure. His authority had been dismantled, and his followers were reclaiming their lives. The combination of legal action, humanitarian support, and psychological care ensured that the village could begin to heal. While the process was slow and required ongoing effort, the essential outcome was that the illusion of power had been shattered and replaced with accountability, empowerment, and hope. The survivors, once bound by fear and devotion, were now free to define their own paths. This resolution highlighted important lessons about human behavior, authority, and resilience. It demonstrated that even the most charismatic and manipulative leaders cannot maintain control indefinitely when faced with collective courage, evidence, and determined intervention. It also emphasized the need for ongoing support for individuals who have been subjected to coercion, manipulation, or abuse, recognizing that freedom alone is not enough without resources, guidance, and understanding. The dismantling of Arik's power was therefore both a legal and social triumph, affirming the capacity of human systems to restore balance and protect vulnerable populations. The community began to rebuild not just physically, but socially and spiritually. Former followers reconnected with families, engaged in education and employment, and explored new ways of understanding the world and their place in it. They celebrated their regained autonomy and learned to distinguish between healthy guidance and manipulation. The lessons of the past became part of their collective memory, shaping a future in which they were better equipped to recognize and resist false authority. Through this process, the village began to transform once again from a place dominated by illusion and fear to a community strengthened by knowledge, resilience, and self-determination. The dramatic events that had unfolded in the village, from the rise of Arik's supposed divinity to the collapse of his authority, left a lasting mark on everyone involved. Life after the turmoil was not simple or easy, but it was a life filled with opportunity, learning, and reflection. The aftermath of the crisis forced the survivors, the community, and even the outside world to confront important questions about faith, power, human nature, and the resilience of the human spirit. For the villagers who had once believed in miracles and divine guidance, the challenge now was to rebuild not only their lives but also their understanding of the world and their place within it. In the immediate aftermath, the village was a mix of relief, confusion, and uncertainty. Many followers had left Arik's domain, seeking safety and normalcy, but returning to ordinary life was not simple. For years, their daily routines, relationships, and priorities had been dictated by a leader who claimed to be a god. Families had been separated, children had been subjected to strict rules, and personal autonomy had been limited. Reintegrating into society meant learning to make decisions independently, to question authority without fear, and to take responsibility for one's own life. This process was challenging, but it was also empowering. The former followers were discovering, for the first time in years, that they could think, choose, and act for themselves. Emotional recovery became a central focus for many survivors. The psychological impact of years under Arik's control was profound. Feelings of guilt, shame, and betrayal were common, as people struggled with the reality that they had trusted someone who had exploited their faith and devotion. Therapy, counseling, and support groups helped survivors process these complex emotions. They learned to forgive themselves for believing in Arik, to understand the psychological techniques that had been used to manipulate them, and to recognize that their vulnerability did not make them weak, it made them human. Slowly, people began to reclaim their sense of identity and agency, learning to trust themselves and their judgment once more. The community itself also faced challenges in rebuilding social structures. Arik's leadership had centralized control and suppressed independent decision-making, meaning that group cohesion had depended on obedience rather than collaboration. Now, without his authority, the villagers had to learn how to govern themselves, resolve conflicts, and make collective decisions. This process was not without difficulties. Disagreements arose, and old habits of deference and fear lingered. But over time, the community began to practice new forms of cooperation, based on mutual respect, shared responsibility, and open communication. The experience of liberation from Arek's influence became a powerful teacher in itself, showing the importance of collaboration and critical thinking in creating a healthy, functional society. Education became another key part of the aftermath. Many former followers had been deprived of a normal education or access to information that was not filtered through Arek's teachings. Literacy, critical thinking, and general knowledge had been limited by the community's insular nature. Humanitarian organizations, volunteers, and local authorities worked together to provide educational opportunities for children and adults alike. Schools and learning programs offered practical skills, academic subjects, and guidance on civic awareness. For many, education was a way not only to catch up on lost years but also to reclaim the sense of curiosity and empowerment that had been stifled under Arek's control. Knowledge became a tool of freedom, helping survivors to navigate the world independently and confidently as time passed. The story of Arek and his followers began to spread beyond the village. Survivors shared their experiences through interviews, memoirs, and community programs. Their narratives provided insight into how manipulation, coercion, and false authority could take root in a community. These accounts were not merely about exposing Arek, they were also lessons for society at large. They emphasized the importance of skepticism, critical thinking, and the courage to question authority. They highlighted how easily human hope, trust, and devotion can be exploited when combined with charisma and fear. By sharing their stories, the survivors transformed personal trauma into collective wisdom, helping others avoid similar experiences in the future. The aftermath also involved practical challenges, such as recovering resources and rebuilding economic stability. Many families had given up their possessions, savings, or labor under Arek's direction, leaving them financially vulnerable. Support programs provided assistance, helping people regain housing, food security, and the means to earn a living. Vocational training, small business initiatives, and community development projects allowed survivors to take active roles in shaping their economic futures. This practical rebuilding complemented the emotional and social recovery, showing that liberation from manipulation required attention not only to the mind and spirit, but also to everyday survival and opportunity. Another important aspect of the aftermath was the reflection on human nature and vulnerability. Survivors had experienced firsthand how powerful fear, hope, and the desire for meaning can be. Arek had not wielded supernatural powers. His influence had depended on psychological techniques, social pressure, and the human need to believe in something greater. This realization was both humbling and enlightening. Survivors learned to appreciate their own resilience while recognizing the importance of community, education, and awareness in preventing similar exploitation. The experience became a catalyst for personal growth, as individuals reflected on the balance between trust and skepticism, faith and reason, and dependence and independence. The broader society also learned from the events. Authorities, humanitarian organizations, and researchers studied the dynamics of Arek's community, seeking to understand how cult-like systems of control emerge and persist. These studies informed policies, educational programs, and social interventions designed to identify and prevent manipulative organizations. Communities across the region became more aware of the warning signs of coercive leadership, the importance of transparency and authority, and the need to support vulnerable populations. In this way, the aftermath of Arek's rise and fall contributed not only to the lives of his former followers but also to the broader understanding of human behavior and societal resilience over time. The survivors began to celebrate their liberation, marking milestones of recovery and reclaiming cultural and social traditions that had been suppressed. Festivals, family gatherings, and community projects became expressions of freedom, joy, and renewal. These events were not only symbolic, they were practical demonstrations that life could continue, thrive, and grow outside the shadow of manipulation. The village, once dominated by fear and control, began to emerge as a place of hope, cooperation, and human dignity. The lessons learned from the past were embedded in these celebrations, reinforcing the values of critical thinking, empathy, and personal responsibility. Reflection on the experience also brought a deeper understanding of leadership and responsibility. Survivors recognized that true leadership is not about power or control but about guidance, service, and the well-being of those who follow. They contrasted the abuse of authority of Arek with positive examples of mentorship, education, and community service. This reflection helped to shape the values of the next generation, ensuring that children and young adults understood the difference between manipulation and genuine guidance. The psychological and moral lessons from the experience became tools for building a stronger, more ethical community. Finally, the aftermath was marked by hope and resilience. Despite the trauma, the survivors had reclaimed their lives, their freedom, and their sense of agency. They had endured fear, manipulation, and loss, yet they had also discovered courage, solidarity, and the capacity for critical thinking. These qualities became the foundation for a new chapter, one where they could build lives grounded in reality, choice, and human connection rather than illusion and fear. The experience had been painful and transformative, leaving scars, but it also revealed the enduring strength of humanity in the face of deception and control. In the end, the story of Arik and his followers became a lesson in the power of truth, the importance of courage, and the resilience of the human spirit. The illusion of divinity had been shattered, but the people who had once believed were stronger and wiser for it. They had confronted fear, uncovered deception, and reclaimed autonomy, proving that no matter how convincing the illusion, humanity has the capacity to break free, rebuild, and reflect on its own strengths and vulnerabilities. Their journey from devotion to freedom, from awe to understanding, serves as a powerful reminder that true strength lies not in blind obedience, but in awareness, courage, and the ability to learn from experience. The village, once a stage for manipulation and who had become a place of reflection, learning, and empowerment, survivors continued to share their experiences, educate others, and rebuild their lives, demonstrating the lasting impact of courage, solidarity, and critical thinking. They had faced deception, fear, and control, yet they emerged with clarity, resilience, and hope. The story, though born of manipulation and illusion, ultimately became a testament to the enduring strength of the human spirit, the importance of vigilance against false authority, and the capacity for recovery, learning, and growth in the aftermath of trauma.